My name is Odessa. I'm 32 years old. And this is the story of how the man I loved left me for a billionaire's daughter, not knowing my father owned the very building they built their fantasies on. I still remember the way the leaves fell the morning Ryan told me he needed space. It was late October in Oregon. Wind swept through our front yard, rustling the maple trees we had once sat under, drinking coffee and whispering promises we thought would last forever. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the branches sway, when he walked in, wearing that same delivery uniform he'd worn for the last 3 years, but something about him was different. Colder. Distant. "Odessa," he said, voice tight. "We need to talk." I turned, dish towel in my hands, trying to smile like nothing was wrong. But my heart already knew. "I've been thinking, maybe we rushed into this. Maybe we're just too different," he said, not meeting my eyes. Too different. That was always the unspoken thing, wasn't it? When I met Ryan, I didn't care that he was a delivery driver and I was the daughter of one of the most successful commercial real estate developers in Oregon. Love, to me, had never been about titles. I had just finished my MBA and moved home to help my father with our business. When my car broke down outside a law firm we owned, Ryan stopped to help. No hesitation, no agenda. Just kindness. He smiled at me as if he had no idea who I was, and maybe that was what made me fall so hard, so fast. At first, my parents were skeptical. My father didn't say much, but I saw the way his eyes narrowed when Ryan shook his hand at our first dinner. My mother was more direct. "You're smart, Odessa. Be careful who you build a life with." But Ryan had charm. He knew how to listen, how to make everyone feel like they mattered. Slowly, he won them over. When we got married, it wasn't in some lavish ballroom, but under a canopy of fairy lights in our backyard, simple, intimate, beautiful. I wore my mother's wedding veil. Ryan cried when I walked down the aisle. He whispered in my ear that night, "I'll do everything to make you happy." And for a while, he did. We were happy, or so I thought. But things change. It started with small things. He stopped coming home on time. He was working late, but the way his voice changed when he said it made my skin crawl. He stopped asking how my day was. He stopped holding my hand. The warmth in his eyes? Gone. Then came the night I found the first receipt, tucked into his jacket pocket when I was doing laundry. It was from a seafood restaurant we'd never been to, for a dinner for 2. He hated seafood. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I started watching more carefully. Late night calls taken in the garage. Cologne he never used before. Then, one evening, I came home early from a business trip. His phone buzzed on the table. Emily. When I picked it up, she was already speaking. "Ryan, if you're afraid your wife will find out, just say so. But I'm not spending another night alone in that suite." Her voice dripped entitlement. And every word pierced me like ice. I didn't respond. I just hung up, gently placed the phone back on the table, and went to the kitchen. I made dinner. Just like every night. When Ryan walked in hours later, reeking of expensive scotch and another woman's perfume, he barely looked at me. "I'm not hungry," he muttered and went upstairs. I stared at the untouched plates, the flickering candlelight mocking me, and something inside me snapped. This man wasn't the one who helped me fix my car, who whispered vows under string lights. He was a stranger. A coward. And I was done being quiet. But I didn't scream. I didn't throw plates. I didn't beg. Instead, I smiled. And I got to work. The next day, I began collecting everything. Texts. Photos. Receipts. Hotel bookings. I knew I didn't need proof. Oregon's no-fault divorce laws didn't require it, but I needed to see it. To face it. To burn the illusion to the ground. A week later, he asked for a divorce. Just like that. No shame. No guilt. I think we both know this isn't working, he said coolly. You deserve someone who wants the same things as you. I nodded. You're right. He blinked, surprised by how easy it was. He probably thought I'd beg. But I wasn't that woman anymore. He handed me the papers. I signed them. And then I left our house, our memories, our love, all of it, behind. I moved back into my parents' home. My mother held me while I cried in her lap like a child. My father didn't say much. Just placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Good. You're home now." And I threw myself into work. I led new development projects across the coast, from Seattle to San Jose. I traveled. I learned. I grew. The pain didn't vanish overnight, but with each building I helped raise, each deal I closed, I rebuilt myself brick by brick. A year later, I met Colin. Calm. Kind. Brilliant. He wasn't loud with affection, but everything he did said I'm here. He never asked about my past, just walked beside me as I shaped my future. I fell for him slowly, steadily, the way you fall asleep in someone's arms and realize you never want to wake up anywhere else. We got married in a quiet ceremony in an old chapel surrounded by redwoods. 3 months later, I found out I was pregnant. That morning, standing barefoot in our kitchen, sunlight pouring through the windows, I stared at the test in my shaking hands and burst into tears. Colin wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "Thank you." And just like that, I knew everything was going to be okay. But life had one more twist waiting. A few months into my pregnancy, we booked a quiet getaway in San Diego. A beautiful resort, jasmine in the air, ocean waves lapping outside the window. And then, Ryan. He stood there in the lobby, smug, with his new wife, Brooklyn. All glammed up and glowing like a peacock. "The daughter of a billionaire," he said proudly. Brooklyn, who giggled as she said, "I've heard so much about you." Ryan told me everything. I smiled. "Oh, Simmons Holdings, right?" I said lightly. "I think they lease space in the downtown tower, the one my father just purchased." Ryan's face drained of color. Brooklyn's grin stiffened. "Wait, your family owns that building?" "Yes," I replied. "And last I checked, Simmons Holdings is about 6 months behind on rent." Brooklyn blinked. Ryan looked like he'd been slapped. I patted my belly gently and added, "If you need help, our legal team's always available." And I turned, hand in hand with Colin, leaving the past behind me, still frozen in shock and unraveling behind us. As Colin and I walked away from the stunned silence behind us, I didn't turn back. Not once. I didn't need to. I could feel Ryan's eyes burning into my back, trying to process what had just happened. A man who once believed he'd traded up had just realized he'd sold his soul for a promise that was already falling apart. Back in our suite, I curled up on the couch with a mug of warm mint tea, one hand resting on my belly, the other gently tracing the edge of the cup. Colin sat beside me, quiet as always, but every so often, he glanced over to check on me. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked gently. I nodded. "Actually, yes. I think I needed that." He smiled and leaned over to kiss my forehead. "You handled that with more grace than most people would." I laughed softly. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said I'd scream, throw something, maybe cry. But now? I looked down at the small bump under my hand. Now I just feel sorry for them. And I did. Deep, aching sorrow, not for myself anymore, but for the girl I used to be. The one who waited at a cold dinner table for a man who would never come back the way he left. For the woman who thought she had to work harder to be lovable when she was already enough. That night, I slept deeper than I had in months. When we returned home to Seattle, life picked back up its rhythm. Our days were filled with prenatal checkups, nursery planning, meetings at the office, and peaceful evenings by the fireplace. And yet, it didn't take long before Ryan's name returned, not by voice, but in headlines. It started with whispers in the business community. Simmons Holdings was in trouble. At first, the reports were subtle. Liquidity concerns. Delays in lease payments. Restructuring rumors. But within weeks, the whispers turned into screams across major financial news outlets. The company was drowning. Undisclosed loans surfaced. They had mortgaged the same assets more than once to cover bloated operating costs. Payments were delayed to multiple landlords. Lawsuits were pending from vendors who hadn't been paid in months. Investors began to pull out. Their stock nosedived. And then the final blow, foreclosure proceedings began on their flagship office space downtown. The same building my father now owned. I remember walking into my father's study one morning to find him flipping through a set of legal documents. His expression was unreadable, but I could tell something was bothering him. "Simmons?" I asked, my voice calm. He looked up, then nodded once. "They haven't paid a cent in 5 months. We issued the final notice this morning. They're out at the end of the quarter." He didn't say more, but I could feel his concern wasn't about the business. It was about me. "I'm okay, Dad," I said softly. "Honestly. If anything. I feel closure now." He closed the file and placed his hand over mine. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for, Odessa." It meant more than he knew. That afternoon, while organizing a site visit with our legal and property teams, I found myself walking through the very lobby where Simmons Holdings had set up their grand office. I passed the gold-lettered logo that once felt untouchable, now hanging crooked on the glass wall. A receptionist sat inside with slumped shoulders and tired eyes. Boxes lined the hallway. The aura of prestige had been replaced by a suffocating sense of desperation. Ryan's empire was crumbling. And still, I felt no joy in it. Just quiet resolve. A week later, my assistant forwarded me a news clip that was going viral. It showed Ryan and Brooklyn leaving the Simmons building, surrounded by a small swarm of reporters. They were being asked about unpaid employees, halted projects, a federal investigation into misappropriated funds. Brooklyn wore oversized sunglasses, but the cracks in her poise were clear. Ryan looked hollow. Disoriented. He didn't answer a single question. I didn't bother finishing the clip. Instead, I focused on finishing our own project, a new family center built near downtown Portland. One meant to provide shelter, education, and resources for single mothers. When the ribbon was cut a few months later, I stood on the stage, my pregnant belly prominent, with Colin proudly at my side. I gave a short speech. This project was born from understanding what it means to be lost, and finding the strength to start over. Every woman deserves a chance to rebuild, to stand taller than she thought possible. The applause that followed wasn't just for the building. It was for every woman in that crowd who knew what it meant to fall and rise again. That night, back home, Colin handed me a small envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "Something I found buried in one of the baby books," he said. "I thought it might help you say goodbye, for real." Inside was a photo of me and Ryan from our wedding day. I hadn't seen it in over a year. We were standing under that canopy of fairy lights, my hand in his, eyes locked like the whole world didn't exist. I stared at it for a long time, then slowly tore it in half. "Goodbye," I whispered. From then on, it was as if a fog had lifted. My pregnancy progressed beautifully. I glowed, they said, not from hormones, but from peace. My mother hosted a baby shower filled with laughter and love. My father bought a tiny rocking chair for the nursery. Colin painted the room soft cream and dusty blue. One night, as we sat together on the floor, folding tiny onesies, he looked at me and said, "Odessa, you've taught me what resilience really means. I hope our child inherits your strength." Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude. "I hope they inherit your heart," I replied. The past no longer haunted me. It was just a story I'd lived through, learned from, and left behind. But fate wasn't done yet. One crisp morning, I was walking to a bakery in downtown Seattle when I saw a familiar figure across the street. Ryan. He looked worn. Not in the way time wears us down, but in the way regret breaks a person from the inside out. He didn't see me. But I watched as he checked his phone, stuffed it back in his pocket, and walked into a temp agency. A man once so proud, too proud to accept a desk job from my father, now standing in line hoping someone might give him one. I turned and walked away. Not out of cruelty, but out of peace. I had no bitterness left to carry. What he lost had nothing to do with money. It was the life he could have built, and the woman who would have stood beside him through anything. But he chose a different path. And I chose mine. One that led me right back to myself. The days grew longer as spring unfurled across Seattle. Each morning, sunlight spilled into our bedroom through gauzy curtains, falling across the small pile of parenting books Colin kept on his nightstand. I was well into my third trimester now, and even with the occasional backache and sleepless nights, I felt radiant. There's a peace that comes with finally closing the door to a past that once defined you. And for me, the door was shut. Locked. Gone. But sometimes, the past doesn't knock. Sometimes, it barges back in, loud and desperate. It was a Friday afternoon. I was leaving a lunch meeting with our architecture firm downtown when I received a call from my father. He rarely called during work hours unless it was something urgent. I picked up immediately. "Odessa," he said, his voice low and clipped. "You're going to want to sit down for this." I eased into the bench outside the cafe, resting a hand on my belly. "What's wrong?" "I just got off the phone with our attorneys. Simmons Holdings filed for bankruptcy this morning." Chapter 11. I blinked. My father continued, "But that's not the part you need to hear. Apparently, someone from their team reached out to us earlier, asking for a meeting. A personal one. I didn't even need to ask." "Ryan," I whispered. My father paused, then confirmed, "Yes." He asked if he could speak with you directly. I let the words settle between us. A dozen emotions swirled in my chest, but I anchored myself with one truth: I owed him nothing. "Tell the legal team to handle it," I said calmly. "I want no personal involvement." Dad exhaled, clearly relieved. "I thought you might say that. Just wanted to be sure. I'll forward it to corporate counsel." After hanging up, I stared out at the busy street. Cars passed. People chatted on the sidewalk. The world moved on. Just like I had. But by that evening, the story had hit the local news. I watched the report from our living room, curled up on the sofa with a bowl of fruit balanced on my belly. The headline read, "Simmons Holdings faces collapse, investors furious, tenants scramble." And there, once again, was Ryan, caught on camera leaving a courthouse, looking like a man unraveling at the seams. No designer sunglasses. No confident stride. Just exhaustion, bitterness, and a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. Brooklyn wasn't with him. According to the news anchor, she hadn't been seen in public for weeks. Whispers circulated that she had returned to her family's estate, leaving Ryan to clean up the wreckage. As the report ended, Colin muted the TV and turned to me. "You sure you're okay?" I nodded. "I think I'm more okay than I've ever been." And I meant it. Watching Ryan now was like looking through a window into another lifetime, one I barely recognized. It was no longer mine. He was no longer mine. His choices, his downfall, none of it was mine to carry. But the world had a funny way of circling back one last time. 2 days later, while visiting our downtown development site, I received a message from our legal advisor. Simmons Holdings had defaulted completely. Per the lease agreement, we were entitled to repossess the entire office space, effective immediately. My team asked if I wanted to oversee the walkthrough. I didn't have to. But I said yes. And so, a few days later, I stood once again in the glass tower lobby, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 security personnel and our property manager. The lights were dim. The reception desk was abandoned. Echoes bounced off the marble floors like ghosts of a failed empire. The elevator dinged. I stepped out on the 24th floor. And there he was. Ryan. Alone in the main boardroom, standing by the windows with his hands in his pockets, staring out over the city like he was trying to remember how he ever belonged here. He turned when he heard us enter. His eyes widened slightly when he saw me, then dropped to my belly. "Odessa," he said quietly. "I didn't know you'd come." I kept my tone professional. "We're conducting the final inspection. You'll need to vacate by the end of today." He nodded slowly. I figured. There was an uncomfortable silence. Then he stepped closer. "I heard you're expecting." "Congratulations." I gave a tight smile. "Thank you." He looked down, then back up. "Listen, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. But I need to say this. I made a mistake. A huge one." I said nothing. Ryan continued, voice cracking. "I thought I wanted more. I thought being with someone like Brooklyn would make me feel important. Like I mattered." He shook his head. "But all I ended up doing was destroying the one good thing I had." I met his eyes. "Ryan, I don't need your apology. Not because I hate you. But because I healed without it." He looked stunned. "You left," I said, my voice steady. "You lied, you cheated, and you humiliated me. But I survived. I rebuilt. And now, I have a life so full it doesn't have space for regret." A flicker of pain crossed his face. "I thought you couldn't have children." My breath caught. I took a moment before answering. Turns out, the problem wasn't me. That landed hard. Ryan's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I looked past him toward the window, then turned back to my team. "Let's proceed with the inspection." We walked the entire floor, room by room. Ryan followed for a while, then finally disappeared down the back hallway, silent as a shadow. By the time we finished, the office was empty. And so was the chapter of my life that he once occupied. Back in the car, I placed my hand over my belly and closed my eyes. "You did good," Colin said, gently resting his hand over mine. "No," I replied softly. "I did better than good." I let go. The following weeks passed like a quiet storm that had finally moved on, leaving the air clearer, the skies bluer. For once, my life wasn't about surviving, it was about living. Fully. Honestly. Joyfully. I threw myself into final preparations for the baby's arrival. The nursery was nearly complete, painted in soft hues of warm sand and gentle teal, with books lining the built-in shelves and a rocking chair nestled under the window. Colin installed a nightlight shaped like a tiny crescent moon that cast a soft glow across the room at night. Every detail felt like a love letter to the future we had fought to build. Yet even in peace, the outside world kept talking. Ryan's downfall had become a cautionary tale whispered in business circles, tweeted by bloggers, dissected by financial analysts. The fall of Simmons Holdings made headlines across local business publications. What started as whispers about mismanagement snowballed into full-on scandal. Turns out, Ryan had not only turned down a desk job from my father back when we were married, but he had also been funneling cash through backdoor consulting agreements after marrying Brooklyn. Brooklyn's father was furious. He reportedly froze her assets after discovering she'd signed off on over $700,000 in untracked expenses. Eventually, Brooklyn filed for a legal separation. And Ryan? He was being investigated for corporate fraud. None of this made me gloat. it just made me think about how greed, when paired with insecurity, could rot even the kindest heart. About how the man I once loved had died long before he ever said goodbye. But life didn't stop for collapsed empires. My water broke just after midnight on a quiet Tuesday in June. I had been lying in bed, half awake, with Colin snoring softly beside me when I felt the first contraction, sharp, sudden, unmistakable. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding with both excitement and nerves. "Colin," I whispered. He stirred, groggy. It's time." The next several hours were a blur of hospital lights, measured breathing, nurses moving with practiced urgency, and Colin never once letting go of my hand. Even when my grip turned fierce. Even when I cried out in pain. He stayed. Solid. Steady. Mine. When our baby girl finally entered the world, a soft cry breaking the stillness of the delivery room, I wept so hard I could barely see her face through the tears. But the moment they laid her on my chest, everything else melted away. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and the most soulful little eyes I'd ever seen. We named her Elena Hope. Because hope was what carried me through the darkest parts of my life. And now, it was what lay wrapped in a pink blanket, breathing against my chest, tiny and strong. Our hospital room filled with quiet laughter and soft music. My parents arrived with flowers and tears. My mother held Elena like she was cradling the entire world. My father didn't say much, he rarely did, but he kissed her forehead and said, "Welcome, little one," in a voice softer than I'd ever heard from him. That first night at home with Elena, I stayed awake holding her while Colin slept beside us. I rocked slowly in the chair, watching the sunrise stretch across the sky like a warm ribbon. My heart ached, not with sadness, but with the fullness of love I never thought I'd feel again. And that's when the email came. It was 4:14 a.m., and I only opened my inbox out of habit. The subject line read, "I'm sorry, Ryan." I stared at it for a long time before finally clicking. Inside was a simple message. "Odessa. I saw the news about your daughter. Congratulations. I mean that. I've thought about writing this for a long time. I know it doesn't matter anymore, and you owe me nothing. But I needed to say it anyway. I broke something that can't be fixed. Not just our marriage, but the part of myself that knew how to love without fear. I blamed you because it was easier than admitting I didn't feel worthy of the life you gave me. Brooklyn is gone. So is everything I thought I needed. And the truth is, I miss the man I was when I was with you. I hope someday you'll find it in your heart to believe I loved you, even if I didn't deserve you. Ryan." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. No closure to offer. Because closure wasn't something you waited for. It was something you chose. And I had already chosen it long ago. Instead, I pressed my lips gently to Elena's soft forehead and whispered, "You'll never have to wonder if you're loved. Not a day in your life." The days after her birth passed in a warm haze of diapers, late-night feedings, and little sleepy smiles that made the world stop spinning. Colin was every bit the partner I dreamed of, changing diapers at 3 a.m., humming lullabies when I was too tired to speak, making midnight tea while Elena dozed on my chest. One evening, about a month later, we hosted a small gathering at our home. Just close family and a few old friends. It wasn't meant to be fancy, just a quiet celebration of life, of new beginnings. I wore a soft green dress that floated gently around me. Elena was wrapped in a hand-knitted blanket from my mother. And as I looked around the room, at my father telling stories, my mother passing around fruit punch, Colin laughing as he gently rocked Elena in his arms, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Wholeness. One of my childhood friends approached me during the party. Her name was Elise. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and she eyed me curiously before saying, "I just have to ask, how do you stay so composed, knowing what happened with Ryan? And seeing it all come crashing down like that?" I thought for a second, then answered simply, I let go of the idea that closure comes from someone else. I gave it to myself. And then I built a life where he's not the ending, he's just a lesson. Elise nodded slowly. I wish I had your strength. You do, I said, smiling. Sometimes it just takes being broken to realize how strong you already are. And as the sun dipped behind the trees that night, casting a golden glow over our backyard, I knew the truth. The best revenge was never destruction. It was healing. It was rising. It was being so deeply, fully happy that the pain of the past became irrelevant. And I wasn't just happy. I was free. The weeks turned into months, and with every sunrise, Elena grew a little more, brighter eyes, stronger grip, a laugh that could light up the room like morning sun cutting through fog. Life had found its rhythm. Gentle, sacred, and entirely ours. I had returned to work on a flexible schedule, mostly overseeing major projects and participating in key decisions from home. Colin handled early feedings like a pro, and our home always smelled of fresh coffee, soft baby lotion, and something warm baking in the oven. It was everything I had once dreamed of, only better, because I had earned it. Then, one quiet Monday morning, as I was sipping tea on our porch while Elena slept in her bassinet, my phone buzzed. It was from our legal department. Subject line, urgent, Simmons Holdings litigation update. I frowned. I hadn't thought about that name in weeks. Maybe months. But the moment I opened the file attached, my calm splintered. The document was a formal subpoena. Ryan had been arrested. And now he was facing trial on multiple charges of fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying financial statements. Our company was among the plaintiffs, as Simmons Holdings had defaulted on rent and several contractual obligations, using forged bank documents during their tenancy. The upcoming court date required my presence for testimony, not as an ex-wife, but as a managing executive of the property that had been defrauded. I closed the laptop and sat still. So this is how it ends, I thought. In a courtroom. Not at a kitchen table. Not with words whispered in the dark. But with fluorescent lights and sharp suits and cold facts. That night, I told Colin everything. He listened without interrupting, just watching me with those warm, grounding eyes of his. You don't have to go, he said gently. You could ask the lawyers to handle it. You've done enough. But I shook my head. I need to do this. Not for Ryan. For me. So I prepared. I reviewed documents, met with our attorneys, combed through emails and transaction logs. Each detail revealed how deep the rot went. Ryan had used the influence he gained through his marriage to Brooklyn not only to push shady deals but to cover his own gambling debts. What stung most wasn't the crime, it was the carelessness. The total disregard for everything we had once shared. For the life we built. For the love I had so freely given him. The day of the court appearance arrived like a gray, heavy cloud hanging low over downtown. Colin stayed home with Elena while I dressed in a sleek black suit, hair tied back, face calm. My badge read Odessa Vaughn, managing partner, Vaughn Commercial Properties. I stepped into the courthouse with my legal team, head held high. Ryan was already inside, seated at the defendant's table. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner. His once pristine posture slumped under the weight of ruin. He glanced up as I entered. Our eyes met. And I felt nothing. No hate. No sorrow. Just distance. A man I used to know, now reduced to a file number and a cold defense. My testimony was direct and composed. I spoke clearly, walking through the lease terms, the missed payments, the evidence of forged bank transfers, the email trail. Every word came from the version of me that had survived him, and grown stronger because of it. Ryan didn't say a word during my testimony. His lawyer tried to shift blame toward the company's internal accountants, but the judge wasn't impressed. By the end of the session, it was clear Ryan wasn't walking out untouched. When court adjourned for the day, I stepped out into the hallway to breathe. One of the reporters standing nearby called out, "Ms. Vaughn, do you have any comment on the fall of Simmons Holdings?" I paused for a second, then replied, "Some people build their lives on sand. I chose stone." No more questions were asked after that. Back home that evening, I returned to the sounds of Elena's babbling and Colin's soft humming as he prepared dinner. As I walked through the door, Elena reached her arms toward me from her high chair with a squeal that made everything else fade into nothing. This was what mattered. Not courtrooms. Not ruined ex-lovers. Not headlines. Love. Family. Truth. 2 days later, Ryan pled guilty. He took a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence but still faced over 3 years in prison, plus millions in restitution claims he couldn't possibly pay back. Brooklyn never came to any hearing. I learned later that her father had cut all ties. He lost everything. And I gained everything I didn't know I deserved. A few weeks after the trial ended, I stood before the board of Vaughn Commercial Properties as my father officially handed over the reins. He gave a short speech, emotional but proud, and at the end, simply said, "My daughter has led through fire. She came out gold." They gave me a standing ovation. But it wasn't applause that moved me. It was the sense of finally stepping into my power, fully and unapologetically. No longer in anyone's shadow. No longer shrinking for someone else's comfort. That night, as Colin and I walked out onto our balcony, stars glowing above us, I looked at him and said something I had never dared to before. "I'm proud of myself." He smiled, kissed the top of my head, and whispered, "I've always been proud of you." Below us, the city sparkled. A city I once feared would swallow me whole. Now, it stood beneath me, built on stone. Some moments in life feel like the world turns its face toward you, not with grandeur or spectacle, but with quiet recognition. That's how it felt the night I became CEO. It didn't matter that I was already making major decisions behind the scenes or that I'd carried more weight than most senior executives for years. The title wasn't what changed me, it was the silence that followed, the sense of peace that came from no longer needing to prove I belonged. My father had built Vaughn Commercial Properties from the ground up with grit and discipline. And now, passing it to me wasn't just a succession, it was a legacy transferred with trust. And yet, amid the soft clinking of champagne glasses and the congratulatory smiles from board members, I couldn't help but glance across the room, half expecting a shadow of my past to reappear. But there was no Ryan. There was no old pain. Only a woman in her power, her past tucked securely behind her like a closed chapter on a finished book. After the ceremony, Colin and I drove home in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that only happens between two people who understand each other's inner language. In the back seat, Elena slept soundly in her car seat, her little hand curled into a fist. Colin reached over and gently took my hand. "You really did it," he said. "Not just the title. You turned pain into purpose." I looked at him and smiled. I think I finally believe that. Later that week, I received a letter. Not an email. Not a phone call. An actual, handwritten letter. It was from Ryan's mother. I hadn't heard from her since the divorce. She had always been polite with me, nothing more, nothing less, and I'd assumed she blamed me for the fallout of her son's life. But the letter told a different story. "Dear Odessa, I don't expect you to read this, much less respond, but I felt compelled to write. I know what my son did to you. And I know it was unforgivable. I raised him to be better. But somewhere along the way, he forgot the value of humility, of loyalty. I watched your testimony during the trial. Not for gossip, but because I needed to see the woman my son betrayed. And what I saw wasn't just strength. It was grace. I want you to know, from a mother's heart, I'm sorry. And I'm grateful that you didn't let what he did define you. I heard you had a baby. Congratulations. I pray your daughter grows up with the same strength her mother carries. With sincerity. Evelyn Carrington. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into the back of my journal. It didn't stir old wounds. It healed something I didn't even realize was still tender, the quiet shame of having once loved someone who fell so far. Ryan's name stopped coming up after that. The trial was over. The headlines faded. The world moved on. And so did I. The next season of my life bloomed with the quiet beauty of routine, baby laughter, early mornings with sleepy eyes, late nights on the patio with Colin as we talked about our dreams. I balanced board meetings and playdates, multi-million-dollar contracts and doctor appointments, powerful handshakes and tiny ones gripping my finger. One evening, while preparing dinner, I got a call from Elise, my childhood friend who had been at Elena's welcome party. "Guess who I ran into at the farmer's market today?" she asked. I didn't need to guess. "Ryan?" "Yup," she confirmed. "He's working at a nonprofit now. Something about community development and job rehabilitation. Looks like he's trying to turn his life around." I let that sink in. "That's good," I said honestly. Elise paused. "Does it make you feel anything?" I thought for a moment. "Not really. I hope he finds peace. But I found mine already." After I hung up, I returned to chopping vegetables, sunlight pouring in through the window. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I was free. Later that night, as Colin tucked Elena into her crib, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the city lights blinking through our bedroom window. It hit me then, how far I had come. Once, I was the woman holding back tears at a dinner table while her husband ignored her. Now, I was the woman running a company, raising a child, and falling more in love with a man who truly saw her. Once, I questioned if I'd ever be enough. Now, I knew I was more than enough. I rose and joined Colin in Elena's room. He stood watching her sleep, arms crossed over his chest, smiling like the world had given him every good thing at once. "She's going to grow up knowing what love looks like," I said quietly. He nodded. "Because of you." I rested my head on his shoulder, and we stood there in silence, the soft sound of our daughter's breathing grounding us. No more broken promises. No more stolen peace. Only forward. Only truth. By the time Elena took her first steps across our living room floor, arms flailing, Colin and I clapping like fools on either side, I realized I had finally arrived in a place I once feared I'd never reach. Contentment. Not the flashy, social media perfect version of happiness. But the deep, soul-settling kind that wraps itself around you at 2 a.m. when the baby's asleep, your husband's hand rests over yours, and the house is quiet except for the slow rhythm of your own breath. I had it. And I wasn't letting it go. Our company flourished under my leadership. We launched a sustainable redevelopment initiative, converting outdated properties into green spaces and community centers. I created a maternity policy that gave full benefits and childcare stipends to working mothers, because I knew what it felt like to juggle power and a pacifier. And in that success, I never forgot where I came from. Sometimes, after a long day, I'd sit alone in my office and glance out at the very building where Ryan's empire had fallen. I didn't feel spite. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clarity. That building had taught me something that no MBA ever could. The foundations you build your life on matter. Love. Integrity. Loyalty. Truth. And if you build on sand, no matter how shiny the surface looks, it'll crumble. Years passed. Elena grew into a bright, curious little girl who asked hard questions and loved bedtime stories. Her favorite was the one I made up about a woman who lost everything and then built an even better life with her own 2 hands. I called it the Stone Path. One warm spring afternoon, when Elena was about 5 years old, we visited the downtown plaza where the community center now stood, a site that had once been a Simmons Holdings project, abandoned mid-construction and left to decay. I'd bought it for pennies during the liquidation and turned it into something beautiful. Elena ran through the courtyard, laughing, her curls bouncing as she spun near the garden fountain. A woman sitting on a nearby bench approached me with a small smile. "You're Odessa Vaughn, right?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes. I used to work for Simmons Holdings," she said softly. "Receptionist. I lost my job when the company collapsed. But after that, I applied for the training program your foundation started. I'm a project coordinator now." Emotion caught in my throat. "Thank you," she said, "for giving people like me a second chance." I placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying my voice. "You gave it to yourself. I just made sure the door was open." That night, I told Colin what happened. He wrapped his arms around me, smiling. "You didn't just move on from your past. You repurposed it." That was the moment it all clicked. Ryan's betrayal wasn't just the lowest point of my life, it was the moment that cracked me open. The pain forced me to look inward, to rise from the ashes with clearer eyes, stronger legs, and a deeper sense of who I was. One last ripple came years later. Elena was 10 when a classmate's parent, a new transfer to her school, approached me during a school fundraiser. He was tall, graying at the temples, with kind but worn eyes. "Ms. Vaughn," he said quietly. "You don't remember me. But I used to work under Ryan Carrington." I blinked. "I remember your name now. You were in finance, right?" He nodded. "I lost a lot back then. But I've followed your journey ever since. What you did with the company. With your life." He paused. It inspired me to start over too. I thanked him, we chatted briefly, and he left me with one line I'll never forget. "You didn't just survive the storm. You redirected it." That night, I stood by the window of our home, watching Colin and Elena build something with blocks on the living room rug, her laughter like bells in the breeze. And I whispered to myself, "I survived. I rebuilt. I became. And the woman I am now, she doesn't need revenge. Because she lives in the kind of joy that revenge could never buy. She walks with peace. She leads with power. She builds on stone. Life doesn't always give us justice in the way we expect. Sometimes the people who hurt us never say sorry. Sometimes they never fall. But healing isn't about watching others crumble. It's about choosing to rise. To build again. To thrive not in spite of what happened, but because of who we became after it." Odessa's story is one of betrayal, transformation, and quiet triumph. If it resonated with you, let us know in the comments. What would you have done in her place? And don't forget to follow Revenge Echoes for more powerful stories like this one, where strength speaks, and silence isn't the end, but the beginning.